He was given a soul as a cruel joke, a debt settled in flesh and silence. The man who received her, a figure carved from the unyielding granite of grief, lived in a house where memories had become ghosts and silence was the only prayer. His heart was a locked room, the key buried with his wife beneath a stubborn patch of earth that refused to grow anything but weeds. The wind that scoured his land spoke only one name, and it was not his own. It was a wind that carried dust and regret, polishing the edges of his sorrow until it was sharp enough to cut. His 2 children moved through the quiet hallways like apparitions, their small faces old with a sorrow they did not understand, their laughter a forgotten language. They were reflections of his own paralysis, satellites orbiting a dead star. Into this mausoleum of a life rode a man named Thorn, a vulture in a fine coat whose smile was a crack in a porcelain mask. He was a dealer in diminished things, in futures bought cheap and sold dear. Thorn owed the man a debt, a significant one from a time before the world had gone grey, and he had come to pay it in a currency of contempt. He dismounted, and from the back of his horse, he pulled her. She was not a woman, not to him. She was cargo, a line item, a breathing ledger entry. Her wrists were bound, her clothes were rags, and her eyes held the vacant geography of profound exhaustion. She was a ghost of a different sort, one haunted not by memory, but by its erasure. A gift, Thorn sneered, the word slithering from his mouth. From the Orient. An exotic bird for your empty cage. Debt settled, the man looked at the woman, then back at Thorn, a slow, cold fire beginning to burn behind his eyes. He saw not a gift, but a desecration. He saw the architecture of her bones, the quiet dignity that even her captor could not entirely extinguish, and he felt the profound wrongness of it in his own marrow. He said nothing, his silence a wall Thorn could not breach. Thorn laughed, a dry, rattling sound like stones in a tin can. Have it your way. She's yours now. A broken toy for your broken life. He cut her ropes, shoving her forward into the dust. She stumbled but did not fall. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving his cruel joke to fester under the vast, indifferent sky. The man stood there, the silence pressing in, now occupied by this new, breathing wound. He looked at her, and she looked back, her gaze a void. He could not turn her out, his own code, rusted as it was, forbade it. But he could not let her in. Not into the house. Not into the locked room of his heart. He pointed a single, rigid finger toward the barn. There it was not an invitation. It was a designation of space, a line drawn in the dust between his world and hers. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod and walked toward the barn, her steps steady, her back straight, a pillar of silent endurance against the encroaching dusk. The man watched her go, feeling not pity, but a deep, unwelcome disturbance, like a stone thrown into a stagnant pool. He had been given a soul, and his first instinct was to quarantine it. The barn became her world, a cathedral of splintered wood and dusty light. It smelled of hay and endings, a fitting annex to the man's house of grief. She found a clean corner in the loft, a space away from the drafts and the prying eyes of rodents, and there she settled. She did not weep. She did not speak. She simply was, a quiet occupation of a forgotten space. Her stillness was a strange counterpoint to the man's restless misery. He found himself watching her, a sentinel at the window of his fortress. He saw her through the hazy glass of the kitchen, a distant figure moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a life where energy was a precious, finite resource. He had established a ritual born of reluctant duty. Twice a day, he would leave a plate of food and a jar of water on the weathered porch railing that separated the house from the yard, a silent transaction across an unbreachable divide. He would place it there, turn his back, and walk away. A few moments later, she would emerge from the barn, retrieve the offering, and retreat back into the shadows. He never saw her eat. This small, consistent act was the entirety of their relationship, a provider and a recipient, with 100 yards of dead grass and unspoken history between them. His children observed this new dynamic with the wide, unblinking eyes of the young. They, too, watched the woman in the barn. They saw her wash her face in the horse trough, her movements as careful and deliberate as a priestess at an altar. They saw her sit in the sliver of sun that pierced the barn's gloom, her face turned upward as if drinking the light. They did not approach her, their father's invisible walls were their own, but their curiosity was a living thing, a small, green shoot in the barren landscape of their lives. In the yard, between the house and the barn, lay the most potent symbol of the man's sorrow, his wife's garden. It was a skeletal ruin, a tangle of thorns and desiccated stalks choked by weeds. The earth was cracked and pale, a testament to his neglect. He had let it die with her, believing that to cultivate it would be a betrayal of his grief. It was a memorial to absence. The woman from the barn began to notice it. Her gaze would drift from the horizon to the derelict plot of land. She would stand at the barn door for long stretches, her eyes tracing the chaotic lines of decay. She saw not a graveyard, but a canvas. She saw not an end, but the faintest, most impossible whisper of a beginning. The man, watching from his window, saw only her stillness, mistaking her contemplation for the same listless emptiness that consumed him. He could not imagine that in the silent ruin of her own life, she was already plotting a resurrection. The change began not with a sound, but with a motion. One morning, the man looked out his window and saw her in the dead garden. She was kneeling, her back to the house, pulling a single, defiant thistle from the earth. The act was so small, so insignificant, yet it felt like a seismic shift in the static world he inhabited. He felt a surge of irritation. That ground was sacred in its barrenness. It was his monument, and she was desecrating it with her hope. He watched, expecting her to give up, to be defeated by the sheer scale of the neglect. But she did not. The next day, she cleared another small patch. And the next, another. Her hands, already calloused and scarred, grew raw, but her work was methodical, relentless. She was not attacking the garden, she was freeing it. She worked without tools at first, using her bare hands to comb through the dry soil, removing rocks and roots with a patient determination that was both maddening and mesmerizing to the man who watched. The children were drawn to her quiet industry. The little girl, her heart less guarded than her father's, filled a small tin cup with water from the pump and left it near the edge of the cleared patch. She did not wait for a response, scurrying back to the safety of the porch. From the barn door, the woman watched her go. Later, when she knelt to work again, she saw the cup. She paused, looking toward the house, and offered a slight, formal bow of her head in the direction of the porch. It was the first gesture of acknowledgement, the first thread of connection woven across the chasm. The man saw it all from behind his window. He saw the gift of water and the silent acceptance. A strange feeling, unfamiliar and unsettling, stirred within him. It was not anger anymore. It was a grudging respect. He saw that her labor was not an act of intrusion, but of creation. She was not just clearing weeds, she was imposing order on chaos, life on death. In her silent, dogged reclamation of that small patch of earth, he saw a mirror to a resilience he thought no longer existed in the world. He was a man who had surrendered to the wilderness of his own sorrow, and here was a woman, with nothing, who was patiently, painstakingly, cultivating a garden in the middle of a desert. The first green shoot that pushed its way through the soil she had tended felt like a personal accusation, a tiny, vibrant indictment of his own stasis. He had locked his heart in a tomb, and she, a stranger, had come and begun to roll away the stone. The garden became the language they all learned to speak. It was a vocabulary of soil and water, of patient weeding and watchful waiting. The woman, whom the man had begun to think of not as a thing but as a her, found a rusted trowel and a broken spade head in a corner of the barn. She spent an evening cleaning them, sharpening the edges on a flat stone until they were functional again. Her resourcefulness was a quiet rebuke to his own inertia. She was a creator, a restorer of things. The children, emboldened by the acceptance of the water cup, became her silent apprentices. The boy, a solemn child who rarely spoke, found an old, intact spade handle in the shed and silently laid it next to her other tools one morning. He did not look at her, but he knew she saw him. The girl would bring her things she deemed beautiful for the garden's edge, a smooth, white stone, a lost bird's feather, a shard of blue glass worn smooth by time. These small offerings were placed with reverence around the perimeter, turning the plot into a secret, sacred space. A bridge was being built, one small, silent gesture at a time. One afternoon, the man saw his son trip and tear the sleeve of his shirt on a nail. The boy did not cry, he was his father's son, but he looked at the ragged fabric with dismay. Later that day, the woman found the boy sitting on the porch steps. She approached slowly, and he did not shy away. She knelt before him and, with a small, unspoken gesture, indicated the torn sleeve. He held out his arm. From a pocket, she produced a needle and a spool of dark thread she must have salvaged from somewhere. Her fingers moved with a deft, mesmerizing grace. She did not just patch the hole, she embroidered over it, creating a small, intricate pattern of a leaf. It was a repair that was more beautiful than the original fabric. An act of service that transformed a wound into a work of art. The man stood at the screen door, hidden in the shadows, and watched the entire exchange. He saw the boy's look of wonder at the pattern on his arm. He saw the woman's hands, how they were not just skilled but gentle. The rattle on the door of his locked heart was growing louder, more insistent. The world outside the ranch seemed to mirror the slow-building pressure within him. The sky grew heavy, the air thick with unspoken promises of rain. Clouds, bruised purple and gray, began to gather on the horizon each afternoon, a congregation of sorrows waiting to break. The atmosphere was charged, tense, a held breath before a storm. He felt it in his bones, a primal sense of impending change, both within his home and beyond it. The quiet resilience of the woman and the steady growth of her garden were a force of nature, and he sensed, with a mix of fear and a strange, unbidden hope, that the drought was coming to an end. The garden, once a plot of dust and death, now offered up its first gifts. They were humble things, a handful of sharp, red radishes, a cluster of dark, bitter greens, and a few small, knobbly carrots. The woman harvested them with the same care she had shown in planting them. She washed the dirt from them at the pump, the water turning the roots to brilliant jewels in her hands. For a moment, she stood with the meager harvest cupped in her palms, a small offering from a resurrected earth. Then, in keeping with their established ritual, she walked to the porch and placed the vegetables on the railing, right where the man left her plate of food each day. It was a profound reversal. The recipient had become a provider. The debt was being repaid, not in currency, but in life itself. When the man came out to leave her evening meal, he stopped. He saw the bright, clean vegetables lying on the weathered wood. He looked at them for a long time, at their vibrant color against the gray of the house. It was more than food. It was a message. It was communion. He was faced with a choice that felt monumental. To leave them there would be to maintain the divide, to insist on their separate worlds. To take them would be to accept the bridge she had built, to acknowledge the shared ground she had so patiently cultivated. He slowly reached out his hand and picked up the vegetables. That night, the smell of cooking filled the quiet house for the first time in years. He added the radishes and greens to the simple stew he was making. Their sharp, earthy flavor cut through the blandness of his usual fare, a taste of life and effort. When the meal was ready, he did not walk to the porch railing. He took a breath, a deep one that seemed to draw strength from the very foundations of the house, and he opened the kitchen door. She was standing by the barn, as if waiting. He did not speak. He simply gestured with his head, an invitation into the warmth. She hesitated for only a second before walking toward the house, her steps even and sure. Inside, he had set a place for her at the far end of the long wooden table. It was a great distance still, but it was the same table. His children were already seated, watching with wide, solemn eyes. He ladled stew into a bowl and slid it down the polished wood to her. They ate in their customary silence, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of isolation and grief, but the silence of communion, of shared space. The boundary had shrunk from the vast expanse of the yard to the length of a table. Outside, the first drops of a long-overdue rain began to fall, soft and hesitant, against the window pane. A new rhythm established itself, as quiet and steady as a heartbeat. The woman, he had begun to think of her by the name he had given her in his mind, the gardener, now took her meals at the table and slept in the small, unused room off the kitchen, no longer relegated to the barn. The distance between them was still palpable, a lingering chill in the air, but the permafrost was beginning to thaw. The garden flourished under her care, an explosion of improbable green in the monochrome landscape. It became the heart of their small, silent world. The children's laughter, once a rare and startling sound, became more frequent, often heard from the direction of the garden where they followed her, helping in their small ways. The house itself seemed to breathe again. The man found himself mending the broken hinge on a shutter, a task he'd ignored for years. He planed the edge of the kitchen door so it no longer stuck and sighed shut. He was repairing his home, his life, one small act at a time, echoing the work she was doing in the earth. He was re-engaging with the world of the living, and it was her quiet, relentless example that had shown him the way. But peace, he knew, was a fragile thing in a harsh world. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, he saw a rider on the distant ridge. It was only a silhouette against the bruised sky, but it was a familiar one. A cold, heavy dread settled in his gut. It was the shape of Thorn. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that the man was not just passing through. Thorn had not given him a gift, he had boarded an animal, and now he was coming back to check on his investment. The feeling of menace grew in the following days, amplified by the brooding weather. The sky was a permanent slate grey, and the wind had a mournful edge to it, whispering through the eaves of the house like a prophet of doom. The coming storm was no longer a promise, it was a threat. The gardener seemed to feel it too. Her movements in the garden became more urgent. She built small earthen walls to protect the plants from the wind and used twine to secure the taller stalks. She was fortifying her small kingdom against the coming invasion. They never spoke of it, but a shared tension now bound them as tightly as their silence once had. He found himself cleaning his old rifle, the scent of oil and steel a grim sacrament. He was no longer a passive observer of his life. He was a guardian, and he had something to protect. The locked room of his heart was not just unlocked, the door had been thrown wide open, and he would stand before it and defend everything that now resided within. The storm and the man arrived on the same day. The sky broke open with a furious, biblical intensity just as Thorn and two hired brutes rode into the yard. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dust to a slick, grasping mud. Thorn dismounted, his expensive coat already soaked, a sneer plastered on his face as if it were a permanent feature. He seemed to relish the dramatic stagecraft of the tempest. He looked past the man standing on the porch, his eyes landing on the woman, who had appeared in the doorway behind him, the children clinging to her legs. A flicker of surprise, then avarice, crossed Thorn's face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind and rain. "Look at you. Clean. Federation. You've done good work, rancher. Kept my stock in fine condition." The words, steeped in the poison of ownership, struck the man like a physical blow. He stepped forward, planting his feet firmly on the top step, a human barrier between the world of violence and the sanctuary of his home. "She's not stock," the man said, his voice low and steady, a rumble that matched the distant thunder. Thorn laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Oh, she is. And she's my property. I found a buyer who'll pay a premium for one so well preserved. I've come to collect my investment. She's not for sale," the man repeated, the words solid as stone. The children, hidden behind the woman, peeked out, their faces pale with fear. The woman herself stood tall, her expression unreadable, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She was not cowering. She was waiting. She was never yours to sell, Thorn spat, his patience wearing thin. She was a debt paid. "Now get out of my way before I have my boys move you." He nodded to the two men with him, who dismounted slowly, their hands moving toward the pistols on their hips. The man on the porch didn't flinch. The grief that had paralyzed him for years had been burned away, leaving behind something harder, something fiercely protective. He was no longer just a man, he was a father, a guardian, a wall. He looked at Thorn, at the casual cruelty in his eyes, and he knew this was a debt that could only be paid in violence. The world had shrunk to this porch, this rain, this confrontation. The quiet life he had begun to build was about to be consecrated in struggle. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The answer was no. The die was cast. The world exploded into a maelstrom of motion and fury. Thorn gave a sharp, angry command, and his men lunged forward. The rain, the wind, the thunder, it was all a fitting soundtrack to the brutal chaos that erupted in the yard. The man met the first attacker on the steps, his body a coiled spring of desperate strength. He was not a brawler by nature, but he fought with the elemental ferocity of a father bear defending his cubs. Every blow he landed was a rejection of Thorn's world, a world where people were things to be bought and sold. Every hit he took was a price he was willing to pay. The fight was a clumsy, brutal ballet in the mud and rain. Short, sharp sentences of violence. A fist connecting with a jaw. The sickening crunch of bone. A body falling heavily into the muck. The second man pulled his gun, but the slick grip and the blinding rain betrayed him. The man on the porch kicked it from his hand, the weapon skittering away into the darkness. He fought with tools of his life, the hard-muscled strength of a rancher, the unyielding will of a survivor. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a celestial hammer blow, as he drove Thorn's second man to the ground. Thorn himself, ever the coward, stayed back, shouting orders that were swallowed by the storm. He watched, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, as his simple collection turned into a bloody siege. The man, now battered and bleeding from a cut above his eye, turned his attention to the true source of the poison. He advanced on Thorn, his steps heavy but inexorable. He was no longer just defending, he was cleansing. He was eradicating a sickness that had invaded his home. Thorn, seeing the look in the man's eyes, finally felt fear. He fumbled for his own pistol, his arrogance dissolving in the face of this resurrected man. The confrontation was short and decisive. Before Thorn could fire, the man closed the distance and with one final, definitive act of violence, ended the threat. Thorn lay broken in the mud, the rain washing the arrogance and the life from his face. The man stood over him, chest heaving, blood and rain dripping from his chin. He was exhausted, wounded, but he was victorious. He had stood against the storm, both the one in the sky and the one in his yard, and he had held his ground. He was a sentinel, a guardian, and his family was safe. The storm, as if its purpose had been served, began to recede. The deluge softened to a steady, cleansing drizzle. The thunder retreated to a distant grumble, and the world was left dripping and quiet, washed clean of its immediate violence. The man stood in the middle of the yard, the adrenaline slowly draining from him, leaving behind a profound ache in his bones and a sharp sting in his wounds. The front door creaked open. The woman emerged, moving not with fear, but with an absolute, unshakable purpose. The children remained framed in the doorway, their wide eyes fixed on their father. She walked directly to him, her bare feet sure in the mud. She did not look at the fallen forms of Thorn and his men. Her focus was entirely on him. She reached him and, without a word, gently took his arm. Her touch was not one of pity, but of command, of care. It was firm and grounding, an anchor in the turbulent aftermath. She guided him back toward the house, his weary steps matching hers. Inside, the warm lamplight felt like a sanctuary. She sat him down in a chair at the kitchen table, the same table where they had first broken bread together. The children rushed to his side, their small hands touching his torn shirt, his bruised knuckles, their silent fear transforming into a flood of relief. The woman moved with the quiet efficiency he had come to recognize. She brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. She knelt before him and began to gently, meticulously clean the cut on his forehead. Her touch was feather-light but steady. In that moment, the last of the ice around his heart melted away. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as a victim or a gardener or a mystery, but as his partner in this strange, unexpected life. He saw the strength in her hands, the fierce compassion in her eyes. He opened his mouth, the words thank you forming on his lips, a wholly inadequate sentiment for the world she had rebuilt for him. But before he could speak, she looked up, her gaze meeting his directly. Her own lips parted, and a voice, quiet and slightly rough from long disuse, filled the silent room. She spoke 2 words in clear, perfect English, 2 words that were not a plea or a question, but a profound declaration of existence. "My name," she said, her voice gaining strength, "is Unmai." It was the most powerful thing he had ever heard. It wasn't just a name. It was a reclaiming of self, an affirmation of a soul that had been treated as a ledger entry. The shock of it wasn't the language, it was the sheer, undeniable force of her humanity, spoken aloud. The key had not just turned in the lock of his heart, the door had been taken off its hinges. He could only nod, the name a sacred thing on his own tongue. Unmai. The dawn that followed was a revelation. Sunlight, clear and golden, poured over the landscape, making every rain-washed leaf and blade of grass glitter. The air was clean and crisp, scrubbed new by the storm. It was the morning of a new world. Weeks turned into a season, and the peace that settled over the small ranch was deep and abiding. The garden, Unmai's garden, was now a riot of color and life, a testament to her unwavering belief in resurrection. It fed them, not just with its bounty, but with its beauty. The house was no longer a tomb but a home, filled with the small, ordinary sounds of a family. The children's laughter was no longer a surprise, it was the music of their daily lives. One morning, the man sat on the porch swing he had finally repaired, a cup of coffee warming his hands. He was watching his family. His son was crouched in the garden path, earnestly showing Unmai a tiny green frog he had found. Unmai was listening with rapt attention, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. His daughter, chattering away, was carefully braiding a bright yellow wildflower into Unmai's dark hair. Unmai tilted her head to make it easier for the small fingers to work. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a mother, a teacher, a center of gravity. The man watched them, and a feeling of such profound contentment washed over him that it felt like the sun on his face. He had been a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life, and this woman, this soul given to him as a cruel joke, had patiently exorcised his demons and taught him how to live again. She had tended the barren ground of his heart and made it bloom. They had saved each other, not with grand declarations, but with the quiet, persistent language of care, with shared work and shared silence, and finally, with a shared name. He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his eyes. He was home. This story is a testament to the indestructible nature of the human spirit. It shows us that even when stripped of everything, name, freedom, voice, a person's identity can be reclaimed through acts of creation and quiet dignity. It is a reminder that family is not always forged by blood, but by the deliberate, courageous choice to protect and care for one another. A man, paralyzed by his past, was saved by a woman who refused to be defined by hers. Together, they discovered that kindness is not a weakness, but the most powerful force for healing in a broken world. They learned that a single act of defiance against cruelty, the simple, powerful act of saying no, can save not just a life, but a world. Their story teaches us that true strength is not found in shutting others out, but in having the courage to let them in, to cultivate a garden in the desert of despair. If this story of resilience and redemption moved you, show your support by hitting the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of the human heart, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What does the word families mean to you? Join the conversation and become part of our community.